Can you share a bit about your new book, The Mixed Marriage Project?
Sure. Well, the book is a memoir that is based on my father's interviews with over 500 Black-white couples in Chicago after I discovered that he had begun these interviews in the 1930s. And it draws on my reflections on this fascinating set of stories of couples who crossed Chicago's color line in the 1930s all the way to the 1960s, and how it relates to my childhood growing up in a mixed race family. My father was a white anthropologist, and my mother was a Black Jamaican immigrant. And I explore how the research they did influenced my thinking about them and all I discover about them in reading the interviews, about my family, and about myself, my own identity as a Black girl with a white father.
Yes, and it seems so incredibly unique for the time. It's kind of unique anyway, but back in the day, it just seems kind
Mm.
of almost shocking and incomprehensible that you were raised like this at a time where the color line was so firm. And I want to mention that Brian Stevenson describes you as a writer who has, quote, brilliantly illuminated the Black experience in America for decades. And some of your other books include Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, and Torn Apart, How the Black Welfare System Destroys Black Families, and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. And much of the focus of your work has been the impacts of race on reproductive rights, family systems, medical ethics. And I'm curious what it was like for you to shift the lens on yourself and your family for this book.
Yes, I have spent my career writing books, four books about racism in America, and focusing a lot on how racist structures shape family policy and laws regarding the family and intimate relationships. So it was really different, first of all, to write a book so much about this intimate aspect of our lives and how race shapes that, but even more so to write about myself, my family
Yeah.
and my feelings and my own identity. But I felt that I didn't just want to write about the stories that came from the interviews my father conducted. That was my first thought. I'll just write a book that tells the world about this
Mm.
fascinating treasure trove of interviews starting in the 1930s. I mean, I think they're really unique and tell a lot about US history and marriage and that sort of thing. And the stories are just really intriguing. But I began to think that my parents' story was the most fascinating. And then what I really wanted to write about were my reflections on it. And my father's research was so entangled with my family life, not just because he was white and my mother was Black, but all these couples became part of our family life together. And I found myself thinking about my own identity. So I decided I wanted to make it into a memoir about about my childhood, about my parents, and the mysteries that these interviews raised for me. How did my father, a white kid basically, started this research when he was 21, even get interested in Black people and interracial marriage? How did he fall in love with my mother? How did his research relate to his relationship with my mother? How did his research relate to my own sense of self? And I couldn't really explore those questions deeply as an academic book, or
Hmm.
even a nonfiction book that wasn't about me, that I wanted to share my feelings. And they elicited, reading the interviews, elicited all these feelings I wanted to put on the page.
Well, that's so interesting. I love this as a memoirist and as a curious person. So when you did start to go through all these boxes, and you talk about this in the book, how there were heaps and heaps of boxes, they kind of traveled with you. You needed to find storage for them. And then you finally opened them up and saw all these reams of transcripts. And So there really was a time when you thought, I'll just take this and I'll synthesize them into a book about this period of time and race relations, right? Well, how long did it take for this sort of maybe tickle in your brain or this sensation that you had
Mhm.
to include yourself take you to actually do, like to actually decide, okay, I really am going to do this?
It it really didn't take that long to decide to do it. It took a long time to do it. But
Well, so are you
you know,
saying that pretty early on,
pretty
once you
early.
began, you knew, oh, there's no way I can't put myself in here?
Yeah, pretty early on because I I grappled with was this one book, was this two books, three books? I talked to some of my colleagues about it, and a lot of them thought, well, maybe you've got three books. We academics, if you could do three books instead of one, that's better, And, one with the stories, one and analyzing, different eras, that sort of thing. But uh, after I started reading them, they just brought up so many memories. It's because my father, it wasn't like my father was doing the research separate from my family. It was so integrated into my family. My father and I argued, even when I was a little girl, about what interracial marriage could do. He thought interracial marriage could answer racism in America. And I disagreed with him from
Mm.
when I was in elementary school. So we spent a lot of time talking about and it was so important in his life too. He was writing this book throughout my entire childhood. And
Yes.
so it was really impossible to even think about writing the book without it triggering all these memories and thoughts. And once that happened, I felt as if I needed to make this a memoir. I just felt compelled to
Hmm.
do it. It was almost impossible to write a book just about the interviews without adding this personal dimension to it.
Yes, I feel like you would be in conversation with your parents and your father, especially throughout that process. I think it would
Yeah,
be really hard to kind of cut that part of yourself off. And he did
yeah.
work on this, from what you write. He worked on this research for decades, decades and decades. And his work on the project shaped your family and it shaped your life and your upbringing. And he never completed the book. And I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, I've really struggled to figure out. It's one of the many mysteries that I grappled with while writing the memoir because he was so dedicated to this project. And of course, I learned that it started when he was 21 years old, not in the 1960s, but in the 1930s. So he was even more dedicated to it than I
Yeah, that
even
became a big
thought.
surprise.
It was a shock to me. It was a shock to me. And another example why his interviews were so tied to my personal identity and personal view of my family, because finding out that he started these interviews in the 1930s meant that he was interested in interracial marriage more than a decade before he even met my mother. Not that he became interested when he fell in love with my mother. So even that first
Hmm.
discovery, how could I write about this interview he conducted in 1937 without grappling with, well, what does that mean for my understanding of our family and my father's relationship with my mother? So that was a part of the reason why I had to make it a memoir. And as I read the interviews and all of these mysteries kept coming up. It ended up being sort of a detective story as I kept
Which is the best
trying
kind
to
of memoir,
grapple
I
with it.
think. We all have sort of a detective
Yeah.
story to unearth in our memoirs.
Yeah, I think that's something I like about memoirs when the memoirist is figuring something out, as they write the memoir. And that was definitely my case. I'm writing it as I'm reading the interviews and asking myself questions and trying to figure out the answers to them, as I'm writing.
Yes,
So,
yes, which
yeah,
probably I would imagine
yeah.
was motivating too. I mean, it might be
Yeah.
easier to get back to the work every day.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Well, yes, because I was not only discovering these fascinating stories about the couples that my father and later my mother were interviewing, but also learning these aspects of their lives that I wasn't aware of. And so I'm eager every day to read another interview, both to find out more about the history and the lives of these people, but also it's sort of like, what am I going to find out about mommy and daddy
Oh
today?
man, yeah, I can imagine also being a little having a little trepidation about that too. Like I want to
Yes,
look, but I don't want to look. And what if I find something out that I don't want to know? And because you're
yes,
really in there in his notes and things
yes.
that they didn't discuss with you. And
Oh, absolutely.
right. So
Yeah.
how many boxes? I mean, how many boxes what were these transcripts housed in?
There were 25 boxes in all of his papers. Let me be clear, of
Oh
his
my
all his
goodness.
papers. 25 boxes in all. I with the help of research assistants, I was able to extract all the interviews and organize them, and they occupied 6 boxes, six big boxes.
That's so
And
much. I mean, how
yeah,
did you? Well, okay, so you've written lots of academic and sociological books before. You
yeah.
must have a system, I'm thinking, but for maybe you
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
making
this is different.
different. Well, how did you? So some memoirists are writing braided or researched memoirs where they are using lots of research and interviews. And I'm curious how you managed. I know you just said you had some research assistants, but how
Yeah.
did you manage the large amount of material, stay organized, stay
Right.
motivated with such a large task?
Right, right. So I there were two Penn undergrad students I had over the very first summer after I discovered these interviews, and they just helped organize things together so that all the interviews were in these 6 boxes, and his uh, teaching notes were in another box, so that there were boxes that contained different aspects of his work. But once I had those 6 boxes of interviews, I decided I wanted to read them all because they were just so fascinating and brought up so many fond but also scary memories, and
Hmm.
questions. And so I decided to rent an apartment in Chicago. So I'm living in Philadelphia now, where these boxes were shipped from my prior home. They had gone from house to house to house. But I decided to spend an entire summer in Chicago. And I was fortunate to find an apartment for rent that was literally around the corner from the home I grew up in.
It's
I
uncanny.
It
You
was
mentioned
so
that in the book.
uncanny, so
Yeah.
uncanny. I looked out the living room window onto my elementary school playground. So it was wonderful though. All by myself. My husband didn't come with me. I just stayed for 3 months, June, July, and August, in this apartment. And I used the dining room as sort of a depot for all the boxes, and I organized them by decades. So there were 1930s interviews, 1950s interviews, 1960s interviews. My father was in World War II serving in Europe, so he didn't have any interviews in the 1940s, just one actually. So then I would take a stack of interviews, which I organized chronologically, and put them on the dining room table, in order across the dining room table. And then every morning I would pick up a stack of interviews and go into the study where I would read them and take notes on them. So that was my
Mm.
procedure for 3 months. Every day I worked each and every day, all day,
Hmm.
reading these interviews and writing down my reflections on them.
And that became the basis for the manuscript.
That was my memoir, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then how did
Mhm.
you decide on the structure? Did you arrive on the structure of the book on your own, or did you have an
Yeah.
editor who asked for something in
Yeah.
particular?
So I pretty much knew that I wanted to somehow weave together the interviews and my reflections and my memories. I wanted to, I would talk about an interview, talk about my father's notes, and then reflect on what they meant to me, to my family, to my identity, just my ideas about racism and interracial intimacy. And I would use that structure so that I could weave together both the stories of these couples, the stories of my father, the stories of my childhood, stories of my mother, throughout the book. Um, and I proposed the book based on that structure. Um, but once I started writing it, when I sent the first draft to my editor, after talking with her about it, there were some things that she wanted me to change. So there were parts of it where let's say I'd read an interview in, 1939, and it reminded me of something in college. And at one point she said, "Well, now you skipped to college. You were a little girl, a page
Hmm.
before. Now you're in college. It's confusing." At first, I thought, I don't think it's that confusing because, the reader knows I'm remembering something. But I was persuaded by her that if I jumped around too much, it might be confusing. The reader might wonder, well, where is she now? How old is she?
So
And
you had to
so
cut some of that because basically
I,
you're
I,
you're looking at the base the source material, reflecting on it as the memoirist, thinking about your
yes,
childhood, and then
yes.
the editor felt, well, now if we add this other part of you, this other version of you, it might get confusing.
Well, the main point was if I put it too soon after I've
Mm.
talked about my childhood, it might be confusing. So what I
Uh-huh.
ended up doing is I moved because there were some aspects of my college years that were really important, and I moved those later into the memoir. Plus, I've discovered a research folder that my father kept on me that included paper I wrote in college and an essay I'm pretty sure I wrote in college as well, and even a letter, some correspondence between us that was even later. So that gave me an opportunity to reflect on, my adult thinking about my identity later in the book. And so I made the book more chronological. The other thing that my editor contributed was I wasn't sure when to stop my memories. Like I had so many memories. And there were some things that, if I'm describing my mother's meals, for example, okay, you could describe one meal. You don't have to describe five different things she cooked,
Hmm.
because this was the challenge that the book is structured around the interviews and my memories related to the interviews. But if I wrote too much of just my memories, it broke the rhythm of the interviews. Do you know what I'm saying? So,
Hmm.
so I did cut back on some of those memories that weren't as interesting or weren't as important, so that I could keep the rhythm of waking up, reading interviews, and I do try to bring the reader into my process because it's not just that I'm writing about the interviews, I'm writing about me reading the interviews. And
Yes.
I wanted to keep that rhythm throughout the book as well.
Yes, and it sounds like maybe there's this toggle between reading the interviews and going back to your memory and then going back to the interviews. And it sounds like maybe
Mhm.
the editors didn't want you to spend too much time away from either toggle. They wanted the rhythm to kind of
Exactly.
stay together, right? So the reader could
Exactly.
understand how to read your book. But what I
Mhm.
have to say, I have to say that you may have another memoir in you then, because it sounds like you've got a lot more to write about that you'd like to, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it won't be academic at all or research based at all. You could think about
Yeah.
it. Um,
Yes.
well,
Yes.
how would you feel about reading that excerpt that we talked about?
Oh,
And
sure.
this might be, you might want to set it up just because for listeners, it might be a new situation for them. This is one of the couples that your father was studying, right?
Yes, that's right. So this comes from an interview with someone named Mrs. Wexler, who was a white woman married to a black man. And the interview is dated February 3rd, 1969. And it's at the beginning of a chapter I called Symbol of Racial Harmony, which describes how my parents thought about, and I at one point thought about our family, that we represented, in our very existence, the possibility of racial harmony in America. So the couple are Charlotte Wexler and her husband Bill. And my father interviewed Charlotte Wexler in 1969. So the passage is, it begins after Mrs. Wexler has told my father how she met Bill at the Hyde Park YMCA, which I reflect on because I attended the Hyde Park YMCA. And in fact, my sister's first boyfriend, she met at the sleepaway camp
Oh
for
my
that
gosh.
Hyde Park YMCA ran. Okay, so Charlotte and Bill parted at the close of summer. She went back to college in Nebraska, and he returned to college in New York. After two trips to Nebraska to see Charlotte, Bill proposed in March 1968, and they married in September that year. Mrs. Wexler gave an "it was like any romance" response to my father's inquiry into how she and Bill fell in love. By this time, I had had enough contact with Negroes. There was no mental barrier at all, she elaborated. And to me, he never seemed like a Negro. He just seemed like Bill, that's all. My father seized on her answer as a chance to probe what he had raised with Mrs. Wolfe, different person he'd interviewed before, which is more of a barrier to romantic relationships, cultural or racial differences. He asked her the very question that troubles me, whether she meant that Bill didn't seem like other Negroes to her. I thought of him as being a person, not of being a race, she replied, evading the question. I see, but I mean in his speech, in his mannerisms, in his tastes, his general demeanor. Did he appear in Anglo-Saxon? Well, he definitely doesn't have the socio-cultural attributes of the majority of Negroes, Mrs. Wexler replied. This response bothers me. It seems that Mrs. Wexler fell in love with Bill because he acted more like a white person than like most Negroes. My father tackled the issue from another angle. He asked Mrs. Wexler to compare her feelings for Bill to her feelings toward the Negro man she met in the college town. She responded that she never became serious about the man in Nebraska because he, unlike Bill, was the socio-cultural majority type, which made him incompatible with her. It wasn't a color difference at all, she emphasized. I don't think I ever reacted to color. I just react to culture. I put down the transcript, unsettled by the exchange, offended even. I began to worry about my father's culture versus race argument. His interview with Mrs. Wexler had taken it in a troubling direction. Before, he had emphasized the cultural similarities between Black and white people as a foundation for harmonious interracial marriages. He never suggested that Black people should become more like white people to make those unions possible. But now the conversation had veered into something more insidious, evaluating which Black people were culturally close enough to white people to be deemed suitable spouses. Mrs. Wexler's comments implied that Bill, whose father was white, was sufficiently Anglo-Saxon to be acceptable, while the socio-cultural majority type of Black people were not. Then I wonder if I'm judging Mrs. Wexler too harshly. Maybe she was simply saying that she and her husband got along, regardless of race, because they shared similar cultural backgrounds. After all, don't most people marry someone socially and culturally compatible with them? Still, her comments made me question something deeper. Did Daddy choose Mommy, at least in part, because she could move so seamlessly in white academic circles despite her dark skin? I don't know whether to see that as elitism or as the foundation of their lasting marriage. When I was little, I subscribed to my father's hope in interracial marriage. The motivation between, sorry, when I was little, okay, so this is like when I did the audio book and I
Oh,
started
please. I've
just
recorded
reading.
audiobooks. Yeah, that's
Okay,
okay. Take your
I'm gonna
time.
start again.
Yeah.
When I was very little, I subscribed to my father's hope in interracial marriage, the motivation behind his years of research. I can recall how my 5-year-old chest would swell with pride when I skipped down the street in Kenwood between my pale father and dark-skinned mother. I wanted people to see us, to notice our three-tone family. To me, we were evidence that people could love each other across racial boundaries. My family represented in its very physicality the solution to the racial battles that were raging around me in the early 1960s. We were a living symbol of racial harmony. But it wasn't just outward symbolism. My parents had created a harmonious home for me and my sisters. Both my parents were kind people, the sort of people who didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings or see anyone suffer. There was never any violence or yelling in our house. I never heard either of my parents utter a curse word, ever. We did everything apart from school and work as a family of five. Mommy and Daddy rarely went out together without us. I now know that for 2 years while I was growing up, they conducted interviews together, but I don't recall them ever going to a movie or a restaurant or a party and leaving us behind. All our activities revolved around the family theme, the equality and unity of all human beings, which was closely tied to Daddy's mixed marriage project. They also revolved around my parents' shared love for travel, a passion they instilled in me and my sisters. Travel was part of our family roots. Daddy's trip to India and around the world as a teenager. Mommy's move from Jamaica to Liberia and the United States in her 20s. Our stay in Liberia as babies. Later, during my first 2 years of high school, we would live in Egypt.
Thank you so much. How wonderful to hear you
Sure,
read that. You
sure.
do wrestle with your father's intentions and your mother's role in his work, your own views about interracial relationships and where you fit in your family's story. All of this is happening in this book. And I'm
Mhm,
curious, without giving too much away, because I do want
mhm.
people to read till the very end, what
Yeah.
surprised you most about what you discovered?
Yes, well, it's hard to say what surprised me most because there's the personal surprises. I mean, probably the most surprising was the discovery that my father started this research when he was only 21 years old in 1937 and met my mother in the 1950s. That was very shocking and upended not just my view of his research, but of my entire family. But then there was also the historical surprises. And there, maybe the biggest was that I always thought of the color line in Chicago, the what they called the way in which Chicago divided black and white people and discriminated against black people, forcing them to live in the black belt. I always thought that was an absolute division between white lives and black lives. And I discovered from the interviews that almost all the white spouses of black people that my father interviewed lived in the segregated black belt. I never thought about
Hmm.
white people living in the Black Belt, and there were lots of them living there. Again, my father interviewed hundreds of couples. Now, by the 1960s, there were interracial, integrated neighborhoods like the one I grew up in Hyde Park, Kenwood, but not in the 30s and 50s. And so,
Right. You don't even see it depicted in movies. You don't see it ever.
no,
So that's kind of where I get my
no,
sense of that era is from movies and books. And I haven't been
yeah.
exposed to any books or movies that had that kind of a relationship.
Yeah, yeah, it was just it was fascinating to me
Hmm.
that this color line that was so violently upheld actually was crossed by
Hmm.
lots of white people.
Hmm.
And what that meant, but just that fact, it means lots of different things. As I point out in the memoir, it doesn't necessarily mean that all those white people that married black people and crossed the color line were fighting racism in America. I mean, there were some of them that said some pretty racist things,
Yes.
especially about black women.
Hmm.
But still, it means something. It
Hmm.
means something that this line could be breached, that it could be crossed by people who are in love with each other. I think that's significant, and that's not really something I had thought much about before I started reading the interviews.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
How did you take care of yourself when you were reading all this material? You talk about making tea, and I know you spent the three
Yes.
months on your own while you
Yeah.
did it, but was there anything else that you did that you think was really important to your mental health, your emotional health while you kind of excavated all of this
Yeah.
material?
Yeah. Well, I went for a run around the yard that I played in as a child and down the block that I lived on, and that was very helpful both because I like to run, I like to be outdoors. It was the summertime, not now, not winter in Chicago, thank goodness. And just getting that sunlight, fresh air, exercise. And there's the fondness of being in this place where I grew up and had such wonderful memories of. That set me in the mood to continue working on the project. Didn't just go straight into the study. I had a break. And uh, I I like to work on my own. I like to be enveloped. Fortunately, this couple was an academic couple. They were affiliated with the University of Chicago, and they had this wonderful study lined with books and uh, rugs on the beautiful rugs on the floor and uh, a leather chair to the side, and it had these big wooden pocket doors that closed, and so it was really it just felt like I was enveloped by
Yes,
books
it
that
sounds like you were ensconced.
included.
I feel like if I was in an environment like that, I would feel very academic, very wise, and very much like I was going to finish my book. This is where
Yeah.
I'm going into the cave.
Yes, and I had a deadline of sorts because I had to get back to teaching, in at the end of August. So
Yeah.
it kept me on track, but also the interviews were just so wonderful that I wanted to read them. I had a hard time breaking at all once I got started. My daughter had to remind me. She said, "Mommy, get a clock and put on an alarm so you get up."
Yes,
It's like I
move your body, get some
move your.
air,
I'm
right? Yeah.
so enmeshed in these
Yeah.
interviews.
What advice would you share? Would you like to share with writers working on their memoirs right now?
I think to be open to where the writing and thinking lead you. That you don't have to know from the beginning where you're going to end up. At least that's the way I did it. And I really enjoyed following these paths that were looking at clues in the interviews to answer questions that I had about my family, about myself, about race in America, that I that just made it very pleasurable and exciting to write about. I love that feeling. Now I again come from writing nonfiction books that I try for them not to be super academic, but they are scholarly books. And I found that creative process of not having a thesis at the beginning that you're going to prove in the book, which is how I
Yes.
wrote my other four books, is to just have this this openness to being vulnerable and creative. And I found it to be a very pleasurable experience, and it made writing easy. I never felt that I had to stop. I can't possibly do this, or I'm bored with it, or I have writer's block. I never felt that way. I always
Mm.
felt that I would continue to be inspired to figure something out, to write down my feelings, to ask the questions. And maybe another bit of advice is you don't have to have all the answers. In the end, I admit I don't have all the answers to all the mysteries, whether they're social or personal mysteries that I was following in the book.
Mhm.
So that's my advice.
Yeah,
Just
thank
enter
you.
it as an adventure, you know.
Yes, I love that. Thank you. Are
Mhm.
there a few books that informed your writing process
Mm,
that you want to recommend?
sure. Well, the very first book I thought of, I already had it on my shelf, was The Color of Water by James McBride, which is a memoir by a renowned Black author about his white mother. And uh, it it was important to me. Again, I had already read this before I ever had any idea of writing a memoir, but it helped in a number of ways. One, it was a reflection about a parent who had a different racial identity, a black person with a white parent, and also he he intersperses interviews with his mother with his memories of his childhood. So it was an example of a book that intersperses different aspects of and forms of a memoir into one memoir, one coherent memoir. So it showed me that you could do that. I
Yes.
didn't do exactly the same thing, but now that I think about it, it's very similar. It was not interviews I conducted of my parents, but interviews that my parents conducted of others. Um, and then there are also memoirs that are about race and place. So my memoir is a lot about Chicago. It's located in Chicago, both where my father and mother were conducting the interviews, but also where I was growing up. And so it's very much a geographic or location rooted memoir. And some other memoirs that were inspiring to me were South to America by Imani Perry, which is all about the South, the importance of the South, but she also intersperses a lot of memories of her childhood and growing up throughout the book. Won the National Book Award, and it's a really fascinating book, so beautifully written. And then also, uh, it's not a memoir, but The Warmth of Other Suns by
Oh,
Isabel Wilkerson, which is all about Chicago and the Great Migration, Chicago as well as other cities, but Chicago features very prominently about the Great Migration of Black people from the South to northern and western cities. LA is another one of the cities. So just that background, and I referred to it throughout writing my memoir just to learn more about the context in which my father was conducting these interviews. And then finally, I would say Sarah Broom's The Yellow House in takes place in New Orleans. New Orleans is central to her memoir and this particular house. And that meant a lot to me because my house that I lived in growing up in Chicago was, I call it a magical place. It was really important to my memories because partly because my father was working on this book throughout my childhood up in his study on the third floor of this house. But all most of my memories of growing up took place in that house, and so I found it very inspiring to see another just highly acclaimed book that focuses on a house as the center from which she draws all of these memories and observations and also a lot of reflections on the city of New Orleans.
thank you for those. I've read 3 out of 4 of them,
Oh,
and I'm so
cool.
happy to put them in the show notes. And I want to mention that when I began writing nonfiction, I'd been publishing and writing fiction. My
Hmm.
very first, for my class, nonfiction book that I had to read and report about was The Warmth of Other Suns. And that was
Oh,
the first
wow.
time, years ago, first time I realized, I don't know where I'd been living up until then,
Hmm.
maybe under a rock. The first
Hmm.
time I realized, oh, nonfiction can be incredibly fascinating and gripping.
Yeah.
I ate that book up.
Yeah, yeah, it reads like a novel, but it's true. It's all true. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
beautifully written. And I took it with me to Chicago and referred to it. I quote from it several times in the book,
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
my
that's just
memoir.
yes, I
Yeah.
saw that. I was really excited to see that. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here. Where can
Um,
people find you, connect with your
mhm.
work, get a copy of the Mixed Marriage Project?
Yeah. Well, they can go to Simon and Schuster's website. And of course, there's an author's page on there, a page about the book with links to all sorts of places where you can buy the Mixed Marriage Project and my appearances at book talks and also praise about the book. So anything you want to learn about the Mixed Marriage Project is on Simon and Schuster's website. And you could Google Dorothy Roberts, the Mixed Marriage Project, and it will take you there. And I also have a website of my own. I teach at University of Pennsylvania, and I have an author profile there, but I also have my own uh, website, uh, which is dorothyroberts.com. I'm on Threads and IG and X at Dorothy E. Roberts. And I will be coming to bookstores along the East Coast and West Coast and Chicago. So again, at that Simon and Schuster website, you can see where I'll be in February and March.
Oh, wonderful. I'll put the links, all your social media links, your website
Thank
into the show
you.
notes along with the books you recommended. And what a pleasure to talk with you. I will see if you're
Oh,
going to be coming to a city near me or if I'm going to be coming to where you are. I
great.
just
Yes,
a
yes.
pleasure to talk with you. And I'm
Yes,
so happy you had the
Bernie.
time during this book launch period. And congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. Thank you. If we had more time, I would ask you about going from fiction to nonfiction and maybe nonfiction to fiction, because
Yeah.
that I'm also very
Oh,
interested
we
in
could talk for
fiction.
a long time about
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
so
I love
another
talking about
time.
that. Yeah.